The AAA game, a title that began to be printed and publicly labeled on games in the year 2000 to show their higher grade, quality, and budgets, with the name being used years before between retailers to mark certain releases as games that were more likely to sell. For a while after this new label was coined, games would remain in a $50 price tag for most mainstream releases, but starting in 2006, most mainstream games would adjust for inflation while also compensating for the increased price of developing a video game, resulting in a new standard price of video games to become $60, with this price tag soon becoming synonymous with the AAA game label. And for a solid 14 years, this price would somewhat amazingly remain, much to the surprise of the gaming community, who was just kind of astonished that the industry had not taken the chance to raise gaming prices sooner. But finally, in 2020, Sony that announced that for all of their mainstream or AAA games, they would now retail for the increased price of 70 clams. And although in some circumstances this was seen as understandable adjustments in certain cases for like God of War Ragnarok and Tears of the Kingdom, because games such as these were actually good and the companies that they came from had a reliable track record. But even from the start, some truly terrible games were getting smacked with a $70 price tag, such as FIFA 22, NBA 2K21, Battlefield 2042, and Call of Duty. I don't even know what they're on now. Modern Warfare 3? I guess that doesn't really matter, but the thing is, all these games still held the same horrendous monetization practices with a nice offer of paying an additional $10 for the product. But understandably, people have said, well, of course games have to cost a lot. They require a lot of money to develop. But then you look around at the indie scene, $40 to $20-ish, hell, some games only $3, and you have to wonder, with as much hours of entertainment these games can offer, maybe even more as compared to these new $70 games, how much should a game cost? Before we answer this semi-rhetorical question, it's important that we establish what goes into the cost of making a video game. Off the bat, we need something to develop a game with. Something like a game engine is probably the more modern practice today, unless you want to develop with something like JavaScript or Binary to be a show-off or something, I don't know. Thankfully, most game engines out there are free, but they will take a direct cut of your sales most of the time, and in the case of Unity, maybe a little too much, but that's old news, I guess. You could also, in turn, make your own engine, which is really tough to do, so you'll probably have to hire a very smart team of people to handle that job who would definitely demand a high wage to compensate for their hard work. So there's a good few $100,000 at least or so flushed down the drain if you go that route. Next, we'll need people for the development of the game. This could include game developers, a variety of types of artists, directors or managers, audio engineers, composers or musicians, animators, designers, and testers. And unfortunately, due to this little thorn in our thigh called workers' rights, we'll have to pay these useless sacks of productivity a living wage. It's alright though, truly, it's alright, because best be sure I will make them earn every single last cent of that paycheck. No weekends off, double shifts, overnights. They'll be crunching so hard, they won't even be able to remember what sleep is. To be fair though, testing can also be outsourced to third-party companies who specialize in game testing, but this will also inevitably cost a bit of money, as well as hold the potential to be fairly unreliable as there's less oversight from you, the developer. If your games need to have voice characters, well, you'll probably have to shell out some money for voice actors. Well, at least that's how it is for now.
Press 1 for more options.
This Nuke guy wows some of the best content on this woke platform, and his
Then of course we'll have to have somewhere for people to work, unless your team entirely works from home, which most larger game developers don't. So that requires buying or renting out an office space, as well as all of the other fun expenses that go into maintaining it as a clean, electrically powered, and properly temperatured building. When our game is finally done, after burning a giant enough hole in our pocket, we'll have to pay someone else to distribute the game as well. And finally, if that wasn't enough, we'll have to go get the word out so people can buy the game. This will also include all the costs of producing commercials, trailers, ads, as well as paying to be able to distribute these to consumers in the first place. Seems pretty cheap, right? And this is just the broad overview. So is it any wonder why it's impossible to sell a game for anything less than $70? Or at least that's what some people are trying to say. But let's look at why these prices increased in the first place. And it basically comes down to the industry wanting to break the ceiling of the $60 price tag, which, to be fair, was already done with premium editions, or whatever you'd like to call the $5 worth of in-game credits and the recolored special skin for an additional $40, But then, why would the industry take so long to make this change? And although we can't be certain, there's two main factors I believe that caused this to happen. One, they did not want to face public backlash, which is why they were waiting for a publisher, or pretty much a publisher now, PlayStation. And two, they didn't need to. Game monetization since the $60 price change in 2006 has exploded to an exponential degree, to the point where a free-to-play game has become a service model that in a lot of cases is more profitable than having a game with an upfront cost. And even then, don't you worry, having an overly monetized game definitely doesn't limit you to being able to have a price tag on your game, as many developers have proven. And perhaps it could have stayed this way, but honestly, maybe this is a hot take. I think it needed to change, because this current model of being capped at a $60 price tag only served to hurt large studios that didn't overly monetize their games. By setting a price tag limit at $60, huge budget games who didn't want to overly monetize their games had to look to other means to earn money, as breaking their unspoken rule of that $60 price tag would have your studio and game stick out like a sore thumb in the industry. And for a lot of companies, this wasn't an ideal option, and for this reason, more and more of them, likely with the help of a profit-driven higher-up, would shift towards monetizing their games with practices that were usually not the most consumer friendly. But not all games have to cost $60 or now $70. We've seen game prices and monetization models, all over the place. And even some who have only had the upfront price tag, and for whatever price that might be, you get the full game experience. The most recent games that have dominated the industry that were not only viewed as great games, but were also monetized fairly are Lethal Company, Palworld, and Helldivers 2. The 3 games I like to quickly look at. From smallest to largest in terms of team size and pricing, we have Lethal Company, a game that retailed for a modest $10, made by a singular developer that would go on to sell over 10 million copies. The game featured no microtransactions, and for a cheap price was a great time with friends. Palworld was widely viewed before its release as somewhat of a joke game, as before and even after its launch, it was just viewed as Pokemon with guns, a game that was made by a few friends in their free time, or at least that's the impression that I got. But to my surprise, the game would go on to be something that was genuinely fun, innovating more on the concept of Pokemon than Nintendo's Game Freak has done in the past. I'm not even sure how many releases at this point, but it would go on to be a massively successful game, selling over 19 million copies of the game. Lastly, Helldivers 2 has recently been released, and although it falls more in line with the title of a double-A game, the game, despite its issues, is honestly incredible. It's offering a Battlefield-esque cinematic gaming experience, all for only $40, and despite its live service model, the microtransactions in the game are genuinely cheap, with the most expensive item being the premium battle pass for $10, with certain pieces of armor costing only $1.50. And for a live service game, this is pretty great. Personally, I would have made a video all on its own about how great Helldivers 2 is for the channel, but these videos take way too long to put out, and I think everyone already knows how good it is at this point. These games all cost less for the player, and less overall for the companies making them. And why is that? Well, I think we need to look back in time again at the first ever AAA games. The AAA title, as stated earlier, would come into its own a bit before 2000 for retailers and distributors, but an alternative label for these titles was Blockbuster games. And these games were called Blockbuster games for good reason. The title was meant to serve as a parallel to the quality and money dumped into Hollywood films. Final Fantasy VII is considered by some to be the first of these Blockbuster or AAA video games. Released in 1997, at the time it was the most expensive video game ever made, costing around $45 million to produce, as well as having an advertising budget of what is assumed to be at least $35 million. This game, as stated by some guy on Wikipedia that could possibly be wrong, but I'm going to take his word for it, cost anywhere from $80 to $145 million to make, not adjusting for inflation. Final Fantasy VII would go on to be extremely successful. In fact, one of the most successful games in the series. And for the time, this game really was something special. Squaresoft were one of the first to ever showcase these new 3D graphic techniques with the game, having opened a graphics research center in both the US and Japan to pioneer this new tech that would push these consoles at the time to their limits. All in all, this resulted in one of the largest game development teams at this point in history, with a team of approximately 120 people. With Final Fantasy VII's success, companies with the funds invested into their own AAA hits, hoping to serve as competition for the game. And as the years went by, teams grew bigger, graphics grew better, and the scope of these games grew larger as storage space increased, and of course, the cost increased as well. This isn't to say that every dem team was spending as much as Final Fantasy VII, but it felt like there was a new baseline for games that people were expecting, or at least wanted, and for the ultra-competitive market of games at the time, this was something that needed to be reached. And this seemed to work for a pretty long time, but as the years progressed into our modern era, these games remained the money sink that they always were, but in general, they started to do worse and worse. Whether because the games themselves were bad, or the games took a giant PR hit for things such as over-monetization, once your game was perceived perceived negatively by the public, a AAA game and all the money that was sunk into it could be lost for good, making these releases much more high risk. And although these games were still lucrative for these companies in most cases, with the new ease of access to game development tools, it was easier than ever to make your own game. And as the interest in these AAA titles dipped, smaller independent studios or indie companies rose up to challenge them. Minecraft is most notably one of the greatest success stories in the video game industry, starting from the mind of only one man to being the best-selling video game of all time. It was teams like Mojang that helped to showcase the true power that indie games possessed. You've heard the term before, too big to fail, but it's been proven time and time again, this phrase is usually far from factual, and in the gaming industry, the term too big to succeed is possibly more appropriate. As games have become easier to develop, and in particular there has been a greater ability to access tools and resources vital to game development, sometimes entirely online for free, a new large scene of independent developers have blossomed through the industry, making some of the best games we've seen in the past decade, and it was this rise that would expose cracks in AAA studios. While AAA studios have become very used to dumping excessive amounts of money into the making of a game that was designed to earn a return on investments, indie developers were able to make great games with much smaller teams, with sometimes even greater quality games without having to ever focus money on things that these corporations viewed as important. Abundant and complex advertising campaigns aren't usually the focus for indie studios, as they really don't have this sort of money. Instead, the better of these indie games would be given free word-of-mouth advertising throughout the people and online communities. And although this isn't available for every game, this praise generated online allowed for small, sometimes unheard of developers to compete with sales of even the biggest developers in the industry. These studios were also helped by the quality of workers that they were getting, or from another perspective, talent these large companies were losing after rampant crunch culture and mistreatment of employees had spread throughout the corporate side of the industry. In fact, these smaller team sizes, if properly managed, could serve to be even more productive than large team sizes, as these smaller teams allowed for members to easily make changes and know and understand every part of a game's development, as opposed to the very segmented style of development we've seen from large game companies. And because indie studios usually tend to move away from the hyper-realistic graphics to instead opt for a more stylized look, less money and time was needed to implement complex tech and optimize performance of a game, because these studios were instead using things like pixel art, which could run on pretty much anything. All in all, these games were just cheaper to make, smaller in scope, and for that reason were priced accordingly. And personally, if I know a game is good, I don't mind spending the money to buy it. If From Software had said Elden Ring was $100 at release, I wouldn't have cared, because the game was well worth the money for me. Which leads us back to the main question: how much should these games cost? Well, this might seem like a cop-out answer, but it's true, and it's that I can't really answer this question. Only you can. It's up to you as a consumer to determine how much you're willing to spend on a game. Only you can know how much disposable income you have, how much time you have to dedicate to a game, and how much enjoyment you think you'll get out of a game. A lot of things I've said in today's video can be argued as generalizations. Generally speaking, I feel that because of their large team size, large corporate-owned game developers really struggle with management, leading to terrible, buggy releases that further damage the reputation of not just that studio, but AAA releases as a whole. Generally speaking, for this video as well, I've really only focused on times where indie studios have made good games and become successful, but we've seen many cases with a variety of circumstances where either bad indie games were made to scam consumers, or fantastic games that, due to their smaller status as an indie company, lacked the resources to help their game succeed in the long term. But if there's one generalized statement I will stand behind for this video, it's that it'll always be up to you as an individual to determine how you should spend your money. There's a variety of factors that I believe are going into the changes that we're seeing in the industry as a whole, but I think it's because of more conscious consumer spending and an uproar from the gaming community on things we feel are unjust or unwanted in this space that has pushed a lot of the positive change that we're seeing today. And if this trend continues, then I think we're in for a lot of great games in the future that are hopefully priced accordingly as well. Thank you all, as always, for watching this video, and of course, a special thanks to this month's patrons: Mads, Dave the Unknown, Griff, Einar Anderson, Turmeric, Maddie Grady, The Commenting Cat, and Jarl Dunking. I'll see you all in the next video, or even past videos. I do try and check the comments on those still, but enough rambling for me. Thank you all again, and until next time, take care.